My guest today will be telling us all about the process, including a very exciting science week that will be bringing brilliant minds and policy makers together so that we can actually see these solutions come to life. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Moenga. She is a genomics and bioinformatics scientist. I know you're like, what is it? What? She will tell you what all that means, okay? But Dr. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me this morning.
Karibu sana. I don't think I have ever had the pleasure of interviewing or engaging with someone in your field. So for our viewers' sake, explain those terms, those titles.
I actually have a feeling that you have.
Oh,
they
yes?
may not have introduced themselves that way.
Yeah.
But there's not too few of us, right? So I'm a plant scientist, in general terms, and that means that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to utilize the information that we have about crops, about plants generally, to improve our crop systems. My work as a genomics scientist, it's to look at the genome. So DNA is the blueprint of life for all the life forms that exist, and decode the information that comes out of that to try and understand what controls a certain trait, and especially if that trait is of interest, say it has to do with yield. You know, so what genetic component across the whole genome actually gives rise to that particular trait, and how can we utilize that information to reach that trait.
Wow, so for you, science is everything. It's the solutions to what we are going through right now.
Yes, but that also exists within a lot of context, right? So science does not exist in a vacuum. There's a lot of policy that enables activities around science, prioritization in terms of technology that we use in science as well.
Okay. You know, we want to start off by kind of discussing the state of food security on this continent, because it's not just Kenya that we're focusing on. Let's think big, right? What would you actually categorize as the threat to food sustainability, our land, water systems? What is threatening that?
So many things. The continent is quite unique within that context. And largely, a lot of the things that have made us as a people more vulnerable to food insecurity actually stem from low investments in agriculture. Low investments within the entire value chain, from research and development, within the actual, agriculture system in our individual countries. If, for example, we were to focus in Kenya, within, specific counties, as well as the downstream sort of value chain. What that means is that we do not necessarily have tools to respond to, say, climate shocks. So while climate change is a major, contributor to food insecurity, if we had more investments in agriculture, we would be slightly better equipped, perhaps, to handle those shocks when they do land. But like I said, Africa is very unique. We have a major land degradation problem. Our soils across most of the arable part of Africa, I'm sorry, I've got a cold, has what we call largely unresponsive soils. These are marginal soils. That means that even when we work very hard to ameliorate with inputs, it doesn't necessarily output the expected, outcomes with those interventions. And to change those kinds of dynamics, like I said, you've got to have very concerted efforts that recognizes the problem and perhaps dedicates a significant chunk of money every year for a certain period to try and tackle that problem. We've got a major biodiversity loss. That's due to many reasons. I mean, we are urbanizing very quickly. Economic growth with urbanization and perhaps slightly reduced interest by, say, young people as they go along in building their careers. That also means that a number of crops that perhaps we could grow to allow for us, whenever, for example, there's a disease that's specific specific to maize, that we have other crops that are growing.
There's alternatives,
right?
But
that can protect us from those, right?
Yeah.
And so when you got that, the significant amount of biodiversity loss, as I mentioned, it makes us even more vulnerable again to other shocks, you know, climate or otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this morning, Dr. Suda is actually going to highlight the importance of this particular conversation and why we should care. How does this actually relate to you? Because it's all about what's on your plate at the end of the day. So when we talk about, as she's talking about the whole chain, okay, where does it begin from what's, you know, literally actually creating barriers to our food security? It's important to understand the entire process. But this is where the science comes in, because when we talk about innovation and biofortification, it means those are the solutions that we want to highlight. So what is biofortification, and just how do you believe this is the solution to the food security challenge on the continent?
Biofortification is largely works within the context of recognizing that a lot of the staples that we consume today don't actually have the full nutritional composition that would lead to healthy diets, robust diets.
All right.
And so then it's working towards increasing the density of those nutrients that are otherwise would be lacking within those staples via breeding, and this breeding can be by different mechanisms. It could be conventional, so this is how, you know, we've done breeding for the longest time. You take a crop that's you know, possibly high in a certain nutrient, and you cross it with another crop that doesn't have a similar nutritional profile, and progressively then you can work towards increasing that particular target nutrient. And this can also be done by other biotechnological means. So this is genetic modification or gene editing or genome editing, etc. We've also, at least within the African context and perhaps even outside Africa, you know, fortification of foods has also been done from an industrial approach. So going downstream, for example, your maize flour. When you go to the supermarket, you see pembe that's fortified. And so this has, you know, added vitamins, added maybe proteins.
And all this is being done on manufacturing
level. This is
on
the, on the processing side of things.
Okay, that's interesting, because when we are picking something off the shelf, you know, you see that label, but you don't understand what it means. What
does it actually mean?
So so what they're doing is adding that nutritional value.
Correct. So they're adding this this extra component. So there'd be, you know, chemicals that are food grade that are also tested to be available to the human body after you've consumed it.
So what exactly is the challenge, you know, that you would say scientists are facing in pretty much enhancing this conversation, promoting, creating awareness about biofortification? Because if this is really the way to go, why are we not seeing this just being every day, you know?
So I would take that from a second part of the question that you asked me earlier that I didn't actually address, how this biofortification contributes to food security. So food security has many layers. It's not just the sufficiency or access to sufficient food, it's also access to healthy food, right? And that's really the biofortification where it comes in. And the challenge with being able to communicate this message is that it is what we call that deficit in nutritional composition is something we call hidden hunger. So it's not something that people are very familiar with. As you eat on your regular diets, you're not aware that perhaps your ugali doesn't have the nutritional composition that it should have. Or when you eat the same type of food consistently for a whole month, for a whole quarter, for a whole year, even though you have your portion of protein and vitamins from your vegetables as well as your starches from, say, maize, you end up having a very prescribed composition in terms of the food that you're taking. And if those foods that you're regularly taking are deficient in one or two, you'll consistently be lacking, you know, those particular nutrients. And so we're looking at, you know, potentially a chronic illness issue, around these things. And unlike food shortage, where you know, well, I slept hungry last night, I didn't have enough food, or I only can afford one meal. nutritional deficiency, the impacts of nutritional deficiency are not immediately apparent, right? And so often we worry about the general health of the population, starting from children.
Yeah.
Actually starting from when women are pregnant, so that they have access to sufficient iron, which is important for your blood makeup, your immune system, and so many other aspects of your healthy body. And so when you don't have that supply and you don't have it consistently, the children that come out of that, the children that, you know, at school going age, often have certain characteristics that imply that perhaps that they have this sort of chronic deficiencies. However, unless they actually do fall sick, you know, there are no immediate interventions, right? Because it's not that you fell down, you fainted because you were hungry, right? And by the time the symptoms become apparent, it's often too late. And now when you look at it collectively as a whole population, can you really have a healthy population when people are not having, you know, a sufficient supply of these nutrients in their diet?
That's a scary thought.
It is
because when you talk about, and I like that term because it kind of just gives us that shock value that people are going through hidden hunger. You look fine, you seem fine, but you're lacking the nutrients to keep your body functioning at its optimum level. Then you start to see all these diseases coming up. It's interesting because just a week or two ago, I was, you know, engaging the Chronic Disease Society of Kenya. And if you see the list of chronic diseases that are out there, again, when we trace it back, it's about what are people consuming as part of it. You know, of course, there's all that predisposition about genes and all that, but literally lifestyle. So here we have these solutions that are coming in from the onset, not at the manufacturing or the processing level. The thing here is, okay, fine, we get it, these are the solutions, but how do we tackle a number of things, Dr. Susan? For example, the cost factor. When we see how much brain power is going into all of this, does this mean at the end of the day, when we start embracing things like biofortification, we're going to start seeing an increase in terms of price for food going forward? Because I mean, someone's got to pay Dr. Susan.
I wish that's how it works. I'd be very happy to see my salary scale up. Well, yes and no. When government policy, when the right government policy framework exists, it really should protect the consumer. And I think you'll find that the Kenyan government is particularly quite aware of this hidden hunger problem. And so we've had policies in place since, you know, 2012, 2015, about flour blending, for example, to ensure that even as, you know, while it might be difficult to actually change people's diets, that by regulating the kind of products that actually reach the consumer, that you do provide these resources in those foods. Now, when a lot of scientific input has gone into developing a product, generally there's that fear, and that really is a very legitimate concern. There's that fear that then the price point, you know, of course, will go up. However, when you think about the economies of scale, right, if we recognize that this is collectively a huge problem, when you look at minerals like zinc, where we've got like 80% of the population that's, you know, deficient in this, then, you know, we have concerted efforts towards this, and this is being led by the government. So researchers at the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organizations will be spearheading this kind of work. So varieties that are coming out of that pipeline are already developed by the public, because these are, you know, taxpayer investments, right? And so finally, when you've got these varieties very commonly available to farmers and being very commonly grown, and they're high in zinc, they're high in vitamin A, they're high in proteins, then there's no premium to growing, you know, that particular variety, because it becomes the common practice to do it. The immediate intervention might seem costly. It'll take time. There might be industry investments that, you know, that lead to those outcomes. But in the long term, I believe that it won't cost at a premium.
Okay. Let's allow our viewers, you know, to send in their questions. And here's just a quick reminder, dear viewer, that by the way, you can throw in your questions to Dr. Susan this morning through our WhatsApp number that you can see at the bottom of your screen. Remember, our social media platforms are also pretty active, right? So that's at K24 TV on Instagram, Facebook, as well as Twitter. Speaking of which, we always like to tease our topics prior to actually coming live on the show, just to give people the opportunity to start changyang, by the way, on our platforms. And so let's just take one, because I can already see there's one here that's from Oscar in Malindi, who says, "Hey Sheiks, napenda show yako sana." Thank you, Oscar. Who goes on to say, "Food security is a major concern in our society today, and I wonder why there is not as much talk about it." Now, I'm a part-time farmer and would like to ask, how can we reduce the cost of healthy food, the marketing of unhealthy food, and improve food literacy to support better diet quality for all people? We tend to look at price first before anything. How interesting, and we're just talking about the cost factor. Okay, so what do you say to that?
Well, that's a multi-layered question.
I know.
And a really good one at that.
Yeah.
I'll start with the first bit. Why isn't there a lot more talk about it? I think there is. It's very siloed. So, it's happening within certain sectors. So the people that are, researching on this, it's always within this context. Food insecurity and nutritional insecurity.
Yeah.
But these are, they're scientists who meet at very high level conferences, policy makers and decision makers, as the country is, perhaps, deciding on what its priorities going forward within that sector.
Yeah.
And it's not apparent to the public that these are animatedly happening conversations. And I think, he's absolutely right that we do need to have these questions and these conversations out in the public.
Right.
It also signals the public that the government cares, the scientists, all the stakeholders, policymakers, globally, people care about this. And there's massive investments that are coming into tackling this issue. And when that is communicated to the public, I think that the farmer would be comforted to know that there are a lot of people that are trying to fix it from different sectors that finally converge at the farmer having the right varieties, at them having access to information about agronomic skills that they can put in place to try and move things forward. Yeah. Now, please remind me about the rest of that question.
Promoting healthy food.
Yes, right. And marketing and promoting.
Marketing and promoting healthy food, and how do we kill unhealthy food?
Right.
Right.
I think one of the things I said earlier is that the hidden hunger is not immediately apparent, and so people don't feel that it's something that they need to respond to very quickly or urgently. One of the things that we could do, perhaps as as scientists and other players in industry, is to talk about it a bit more.
Correct, yeah.
And in that way, by raising that awareness, then people are very cognizant. And even when they go to the mama mboga, or they're going to the supermarket, or they're taking their kids out on a Sunday afternoon from church, they're making very informed decisions about what it is they're consuming.
Right.
Because they become very aware, right? It's always in the back of your mind. Yeah. Oh, well, this is a challenge, this is a problem. And it might not become apparent even in my children as I feed them. And so, as I decide in the morning, what's my diet for my family? There are healthy or healthful implications for choosing this versus that.
Correct.
So instead of the sausages, perhaps ndoma, twice a week might be a much better much better alternative. So I think it's really putting that buzz in the ear of Kenyans that there is a real problem. The numbers are staggering. Yeah. The impact at an individual level, cognitively, physically, now and in the future, really, it's so staggering. It is. And I like to think about this in the context of again, just the uniqueness of the African continent. The quintessential Kenyan is a 19-year-old person, right? Like 19, they haven't even gone to the workforce, right? They're just beginning to imagine what their lives are going to be like. They've got to be very aware of the global dynamics, what works, what doesn't, where do they really, what's their purpose. They have to be physically capable of being robust in the workforce, right?
Yeah.
And they cannot do that
because
while
of
eating, you know, unhealthy diets. And that's in the whole scale, right? The very downstream, very bad ones, or, you know, a deficiency in multiple components that would otherwise be useful. Yeah.
Well said, Dr. Susan. I think for me, this is just such a huge learning curve because it challenges each and every one of us, if you think about it, because it boils down to what you're feeding your family and why we should ultimately care about some of the innovations and some of the suggestions, recommendations, let me put it that way, that scientists are actually giving us today. So what's your take on this particular discussion? We've sampled one text message. We hope there'll be many more when we get back as we engage Dr. Susan this morning. We're going to be asking her questions, obviously, around the safety factor of biofortified food, fortification food. And obviously, when we talk about issues to do with the GMO factor, where does that come in? There's a lot of speculation when it comes to biofortification or biofortified foods, rather. So go ahead and also keep sending in those questions through our platforms. We'll see what we can do after the short commercial break.